Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Melody's Choice by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1, 1870, Cincinnati, Ohio. Melody stood near the reception room window, listening to the howl of the wind and the pounding rain. Fat drops of rain pelted so hard against the windows that she feared they might break. Through the window, she saw only darkness and the shadows of trees swaying. Her parents were out there and had been for hours before the storm started up in the late afternoon. She crossed her arms across her chest and murmured a prayer. "Dear Lord, please help Ma and Pa come home safely." She had declined the invitation to accompany them for an outing in the countryside to visit friends. Now she fervently wished that she had not let a small thing such as a cold stop her from going. It would have been far better to be with them than to sit at home worrying. She glanced at the clock for what seemed like the 100th time. A few minutes to midnight. She let out a nervous laugh. Her parents had probably decided to spend the night at their friend's home when the storm begun. The best thing to do was to go to bed so that she would wake up early to welcome them home in the morning. Wearily, she carried the lantern to her chambers on the second floor and got ready for bed, all the while sure that she would not get any sleep. But as soon as she slipped between the warm bed sheets, her eyes grew heavy and soon a blanket of blackness came over her. The following morning, she woke up to a weak winter sun streaming its rays through the drapes. At once, she remembered that her parents had not come home, and she jumped out of bed. Still in her night dress, she hurried out of her chambers and raced down the hallway to her parents' chamber. The bed was neatly made and unslept in. They had not come home in the night. It was early yet, Melody told herself as she readied for the day. A nagging doubt crept into her mind. Her parents would know that she would worry if they did not come home, so they would have made sure they got home very early in the morning before she woke up. A feeling of uneasiness settled in her stomach. After dressing, she made her way downstairs to the dining room. "Good morning, Miss Hanley," Mrs. Johnson, the housekeeper, said, walking into the dining room from the kitchen. "Breakfast is ready. Shall I serve you?" "Just tea, please," Melody said, pulling out a chair. "There's been no word from Mother or Father?" "No, I'm afraid not," Mrs. Johnson said. "But I'm sure they are on the way back right now. Why? The storm only lasted half a day." Melody took comfort in Mrs. Johnson's optimistic words, and when the tea was served, she asked for pancakes as well. The only trouble was that she could not bring herself to go about her daily activities. After breakfast, she went to the drawing room and picked up her sewing, her ears cocked to any movements outside. Her concentration was terrible for the next few hours, but when the clock struck 11, she dropped her sewing. She'd had enough. The waiting was driving her insane, and she couldn't just sit idly. Before she could get up, a knock sounded on the door. Finally, they were home, or they had sent a message. She heard the swing of the door and voices, but could not make out the words. "It's the constable," Mrs. Johnson said, peering into the drawing room. "Please let him in," Melody said, and got to her feet to receive him. As soon as he entered the parlor and her gaze met his, she knew something was wrong. Fear coursed through her. If only she could cover her ears so that she'd not hear what he had to say. She hid her feelings under a veil of calmness and struck out her hand. They shook hands solemnly, and then she invited him to sit down. "Miss Hanley, I'm afraid I'm a bearer of distressing news," he said. "Your parents got caught in the storm as they were crossing the bridge. The carriage was washed out into the river, and we only found their bodies this morning. I'm very sorry." She slipped from the chair and landed on the rug. A blood-curdling scream filled the air. Melody heard footsteps and voices from a distance. "Is there someone we can get for you?" There was no one, Melody tried to tell the constable. It was just her and parents. They were the only family she had. "Yes, there's a fiancé, Brady Carlton." She had forgotten all about him. Strong hands came under her arms and lifted her off the ground onto a couch. Slowly, she became aware of her surroundings. "I've sent for the doctor, Miss Hanley," the constable said. Small animal noises left her mouth. It was too late for the doctor. He could not bring her parents back to life. Melody rocked herself back and forth. What would happen to her without her parents? Her eyes bounced around the huge parlor. How would she live in the big house all alone? She lost all concept of time. The door creaked open, and a few minutes later, Brady strolled in, heading straight to her. "I shall take care of her now, Constable. She's in good hands," he said, with the authoritative voice he used to get people to do his bidding. He sat by her side on the couch and placed his hand on her shoulder. Desperate for comfort, she lay her head on his shoulder. The constable murmured more words of condolences and excused himself. "Don't worry, Melody. I'm here to take care of you. Everything shall be fine," he said. What was Brady talking about? How could everything be fine with her parents gone? Images of the twisted carriage and her parents lying lifelessly on the banks of the river haunted her. She tried to share it with Brady. "I keep seeing them," she sniffed, "hurt and in pain." "Forget about that and think of the future," he said. "We will get married as soon as possible so that you're not alone anymore." She inched away from him and searched his face. "I can't think of marriage now with my parents gone." "I don't mean now, of course," he said, a frown coming over his cold, handsome features. "After the funeral." She shook her head but felt too weak to argue. "Oh, Pa, Ma, why didn't you wait for the storm to abate?" The answer came to her instantly. They had not wanted her to worry, so they had risked their lives to come home. A scream rose up her throat, and when it came out, it echoed throughout the house. "Goodness, Melody, why are you making such a spectacle over this? You're not the only one who has felt the loss," Brady said. The doctor entered the parlor at that moment. "Miss Melody, I'm so very sorry for your loss. Your parents shall be missed." He bowed his head respectfully. He had known her parents for years, and she knew his sorrow was real. "Shall we go to your chambers for privacy?" The tears came then, and she allowed Dr. Thompson to help her up. "I'll come too," Brady said, and to Melody's relief, the doctor asked him to remain in the drawing room. She'd had enough of him and everyone. She just wanted to cry and mourn for her dear parents. Chapter 2. Melody sat unmoving with a book on her lap, its pages unturned for the last hour. Time had taken to crawling by since they had laid her parents to rest. Days blurred into one, and were it not for the servants, she would not have known what day it was. She was glad that it was a weekday, and there was little chance of Brady calling. He exhausted her with his constant demands that they set a wedding day. She had imagined that when she met the gentleman she was meant to marry that she would know it. Instead, Brady brought out feelings of resentment in her, and when her parents had been alive, he had simply irritated her with his arrogance. He was not a man she would choose to marry, but as he kept pointing out, she was alone now and needed the protection of a man. The doorbell rang, and rather than wait for the servants to open the door, Melody jumped to her feet and hurried to open it herself. She was met by a large banquet of red roses, so large she could not see the person behind them. The messenger handed them to her and presented her with a card. "To my dear Melody, with love, Brady." Guilt flooded her as she remembered the negative thoughts she had harbored about him just minutes earlier. She took the flowers and sniffed them appreciatively. They carried the scent of fall, and somewhere inside her, something shifted. The messenger left, and she stood on the porch doing something she hadn't done since the death of her parents. She admired the green lawn and the riot of red from the maple trees lining the long drive. Hope rose within her. It did not completely dislodge the sorrow, but for the first time in weeks, she peeked into the future. Brady's roses had lifted the veil of grief just a little. Perhaps she had misjudged him. He beseeched her constantly to set a date for their wedding, but so far she had resisted, thinking it was not the right time. Now she wondered if there would ever be a right time for her. The right time would be with her parents there, but they were gone and were never coming back. It was time to move on with her life. She would accept Brady's proposal and set a wedding date. She returned to the house and went to the kitchen to ask Mrs. Johnson to have the carriage ready to take her to town. Smiling as she imagined Brady's reaction, she went up to her room to fetch her bonnet and a black cloak, dressed still in mourning as she was. What color wedding dress would she wear? Surely not a very brightly colored one? The guests would understand that she was still in mourning, wouldn't they? The carriage was waiting at the front of the house. "Thank you, Tom," she greeted the coachman as he helped her in. She sniffed the sweet autumn air and smiled in anticipation of Brady's reaction when she surprised him at the bank. She had not left home in weeks, but it felt good to have something to look forward to. The carriage driver navigated the busy Cincinnati streets, and soon enough it came to a stop in front of a 3-story terracotta structure that housed the bank. "Come for me in an hour," she instructed Tom. "Yes, ma'am," he said and touched his hat. Adjusting her dress and cloak, she made her way into the building and walked past the banking hall to the private offices at the end. Mrs. Whiteley, a gray-haired lady, looked up and recognizing Melody, she greeted her and waved her through to the foyer. Brady's office was one of the 3 that shared the square foyer, and as she lifted her hand to push the slightly ajar door open, voices wafted out to her. She halted when she heard her name. "I'll tell her, my darling. Why don't you be a little patient? This is our future I'm working on," Brady said. Melody pushed her ear to the door to hear better. "But what if you fall in love with her?" a female voice asked. Brady let out a snort. "No chance of that happening, my love. There's no other woman who can compare to you. I've told you why I'm doing this." "Tell me again," the female voice pouted. It hit Melody then whose voice it was. It was Anne Kensington, a woman who was unfriendly as she was unpleasant. What was she doing in Brady's office, and who were they talking about? Surely it could not be her? "You like Melody's house, don't you?" Brady said, and then waited a beat before continuing. "It'll be ours, if we're patient. I'll marry Melody, but not for long, and I'll take care of her, and then we'll get married and never have to worry about money ever again." Melody covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a cry. "I don't understand why you have to marry her," Anne said. "You have expensive tastes, and I'm afraid my position here at the bank doesn't pay enough to keep you well." Anne giggled. Melody's knees trembled and banged against each other. She felt as if she had been caught in a nightmare and couldn't rouse herself. "Do you kiss her?" A scream rose up Melody's throat. "Yes, of course," Brady said. "I have to be convincing in my feigned love for her, but my thoughts are always with you, even when I kiss her." Unable to listen anymore, Melody crept away and burst out of the bank, her heart pounding hard in her chest. She looked wildly up and down the street and remembered she had instructed Tom to pick her up in an hour. Fearing that Brady or Anne Kensington would find her there, she crossed the road to stand under an awning. She leaned on the wall of the store. Her heart felt like it was being torn into pieces as self-pity came over her. Her throat tightened painfully as she thought of what her life had become. It was not enough that she was now an orphan. Her own fiancé was plotting against her, and for what? To steal her property. Seeing the bank doors open, she turned and entered the store. She grabbed a newspaper from the newsstand and turned the pages, feigning interest. A page full of adverts caught her eye. "Mail order bride wanted." One read and intrigued. Melody read on. She had heard about the practice, of course, but had laughed in amusement as the maids at home spoke about it. It was not something anyone of her class would contemplate, not when their lives were so comfortable. The door to the store opened and she looked up, petrified. To her relief, she saw it was a middle-aged woman, and she turned back to the paper. Would she live the rest of her life hiding as though she was a criminal? As she read the adverts, an idea came to her mind. True, months ago she would not have contemplated such a crazy thing as becoming a mail-order bride, but life had changed. She was not that innocent, cared-for Melody of the past. She was someone who had to do everything in her power to survive. Chapter 3. Melody sat in the library after dinner, circling any adverts that interested her. The pen in her hand trembled as she drew circles around the adverts. The servants had retired to their quarters for the night, and seated alone in the near-dark room, She had never felt as alone as she did at that moment. She looked up at a portrait of her pa, illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. His kind brown eyes seemed to be smiling down at her. She felt the loss afresh, as though her parents had died the previous day. Oh, Pa, what should I do? How she longed for his wise words of advice. What if she went to the West and the man turned out to be a horrible person? The journey itself was wrought with danger, from what she had heard. There was the risk of being attacked by marauders or bandits. Then she thought of the alternative. Brady was not a man who easily gave up on what he wanted. One way or the other, he would steal her property, and the only way to save herself was to leave Cincinnati. Decision made, she turned back to the paper and the adverts she had circled. After reading them again, she zeroed in on one from a rancher in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He mentioned living with his siblings on a ranch, and that drew her interest. Family was important, and a person who valued their family enough to live with them had to be a good person. She braced herself and decided to write to him before she changed her mind with the light of the day. Dear Sir, my name is Melody Hanley from the city of Cincinnati in Ohio. I'm replying to your advert in the matrimonial news, and I hope that I'm not too late. I suppose I ought to begin by telling you a little about myself. I'm 21 years of age, and I've lived in Cincinnati all my life. I'm the only child of the late Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Hanley. I lost my parents a few weeks ago, and although they haven't left me lacking, I find that I must leave Ohio and begin life afresh elsewhere. I've been well raised and educated to run a home and to do all that is reasonably expected of a wife. I realize that it does seem odd, with the advantages I have mentioned, that I should seek to be a mail-order bride. I've recently come to discover that the gentleman I'm engaged to marry is in love with another lady, and he plans to marry me and then be rid of me so as to inherit my property. I'm frightened that if I remain in Ohio, I'll be putting my life at risk. I hope that my honesty does not avert your interest, but if it does, I shall not hold it against you. Sincerely, Melody Hanley. The following morning, she gave Mrs. Johnson the letter for posting, before she lost her nerve. It seems that after that, the minutes and hours conspired against her. Time seemed to drag, and worse, Brady dropped by more often, even during the week. Knowing what she did of his plot, she used every ounce of her self-control to act kindly towards him. But more often than not, she told Mrs. Johnson to plead excuses of why she could not see him. It was risky, as knowing Brady, he was getting more and more worked up. But how could she socialize with a person who was planning to murder her? Thankfully, the reply to her letter eventually arrived, and as soon as Mrs. Johnson brought her the mail in the library, she tore open the letter. Dear Miss Hanley, may I call you Melody? What a beautiful name you have. I wish I could say the same of mine, which is Emery Jenkins, and I'm the second child of the late Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. I do know the pain of losing one's parents, and I'd like to offer my sincere condolences. I read your letter with mounting shock that a trusted person can plot such risk on a vulnerable lady. I pray for you every night since I received your letter, and shall continue to do so. You must keep your plans very private, as a man of such character would easily harm you if he suspected your plans to escape. I should tell you more about myself. My parents came to the West almost 25 years ago, and they lived in several places before settling down on a ranch in Cheyenne. Have you heard of it? I'm afraid it's not such a picturesque city. However, once one leaves the town, the landscape does improve. The ranch is very large and supports my brother Lance and my sisters and their families. If you like, I shall enclose a photograph in my next letter, and if you don't mind terribly, I'd love to see a likeness of you. Is it too much trouble to ask for a photograph? Please tell me more about yourself. I know you've lived in the city all your life. Do you think you'll be happy out here in the West? It can be lonely for a person who is used to the comforts of the West and does not enjoy the outdoors. I'd hate for you to come out here and dislike it. There's only one main street in Cheyenne, but we do get whatever we need from catalogs, though not often. Once you look past the lack of comforts, you'll see the beauty that surrounds us here on the ranch. There's a fine picnic spot south of the ranch with a creek with clear crystal water and pools of fish. towering oak trees provide a perfect shade and privacy, and the grass along the creek provides a comfortable place to sit. Describing this to you has given me an idea. I shall build a bench by the oak tree so that you will not have to sit on the grass. Which leads me to ask the next question. I know I should wait until we have known each other for a longer time, but I feel that I know you already. You are from a good family, and I believe we shall be happy together. In other words, my dear Melody, I'm proposing marriage to you. I shall not sleep a wink until I hear from you, and I hope that your answer shall be in the affirmative. Please keep yourself safe and always make sure you surround yourself with people. Sincerely, Emery Jenkins. Chapter 4. Melody's heart raced to near explosion as Brady paced the width of the drawing room. He had raged for the last 15 minutes, and the only reassurance she had was that there were servants in the house. He would do her no harm when there were people. Emery, her husband-to-be, had advised her to always ensure she was surrounded by people. It was good advice, especially in moments such as these, when Brady had reached the end of his patience. I don't understand, Melody, he said, and stopped pacing to glare at her. What's stopping you, unless you've no intention of marrying me? His nostrils flared and his chest rose up and down as he waited for her answer. Melody dropped her gaze. She thought fast as she feigned interest in her sewing. She had written to Emery and accepted his proposal. Surely, it wouldn't be long before he sent her a train ticket and directions for her journey to Cheyenne. With that in mind, she made a quick decision. She placed her sewing on her lap and smiled at Brady, afraid the smile would turn to a grimace. I know you've been more than patient, she said, her voice faltering. She forced herself to continue. I'm ready to set a wedding date now. Brady's countenance underwent a drastic change. He stopped pacing and his face split into a beam. He placed his hands on his hips as one who had worked hard all week and month. I can't tell you how pleased that makes me. He strolled across the room, took her hands, and pulled her to her feet. His hot breath on her face made her stomach churn. He planted a kiss on her lips, and it was all she could do not to push him away. Are you as excited as I am? He said, and without waiting for an answer, he continued. I'm sure you can't wait to do all those things ladies love, such as selecting a wedding dress and flowers. Melody thought the skin on her face would split from the strain of smiling. Yes, I can't wait. I shall go and speak with the Reverend immediately so we can set a date. 3 weeks from now should do it. Her heart dropped to her feet. 3 weeks was too soon. That's hardly enough time to make the arrangements. He frowned. Melody, I hope you understand that we can't have as big a wedding as we would have if your parents were alive. She nodded. Of course, but 3 weeks? Would that be enough time for Emery to send her the ticket? What would happen if her wedding day arrived and she was still in Cincinnati? A month, perhaps. He laughed and gestured generously. Why not? Deep in thought, he seemed to forget that she was in the room as he strolled to the window and looked out. Then he turned to her abruptly. Can you give me a quick tour of the house? You want us to live here? Melody asked. Yes, of course. We can't let this lovely house go to waste, he said as he led the way out of the drawing room and to the stairs. They passed Nora, a uniformed maid. Brushing past her, Brady stopped and stared at her as she retreated. We'll have to replace the servants. Why? They've been with us for a long time, Melody protested without much conviction. They'll find new positions somewhere, he said and waved a dismissive hand. She followed him up the stairs. Let's start with the master and mistress quarters, he said. She led the way to her parents' chambers. I thought we should close up this part of the house. It'll remind me too much of my grief. And where shall we sleep once we're married? My chambers, Melody said, holding her breath. It's large enough. The earlier you get used to this being our home, the easier it will be. We'll repaint the rooms and order new furniture. In saddened Melody. It saddened Melody that someone she had known her whole life would be so callous and inconsiderate towards her. She shuddered to think that she would have married him and had to do his every bidding. It was by God's grace that she had discovered that he was an evil person before they were married. He murmured as he toured the rooms, speaking of changing the furniture and how he wanted the house changed. Every so often he glanced at her, and each time he looked surprised to see her as if he was expecting her to be someone else. She now knew who that person was, Anna Kensington. How easy it would be for Brady to end their engagement and marry the woman he loved instead. The reason, however, was simple: greed. He wanted the woman he loved as well as Melody's wealth. When he finally left, Melody waited for 20 minutes before leaving for town. She had to see the family lawyer. Sitting around doing nothing reminded her of the period immediately preceding her parents' death. She needed to do something. Brady had left her agitated and listless. There was no chance of running into him as the lawyer's office was on the opposite end of town. "Mr. Higgins is seeing someone. Will you wait?" his receptionist asked her. "Yes, thank you," Melody said, and settled into one of the comfortable armchairs to wait. She hadn't given much thought to what she intended to tell the lawyer. Perhaps only that she would be going away, and she needed him to oversee her affairs while she was gone. There was no point in telling him that she was going to the West to get married. The scorn and shock in his eyes would be too much, and she was sure he would try to convince her to stay. She had known him all her life, as he was a family friend as well as the family lawyer. He would want the best for her, and to him that was to marry Brady. 20 or so minutes later, the door finally opened and an older gentleman exited the office. It was Melody's turn to enter. "How are you doing, my dear?" Mr. Higgins asked, his face creased with worry. His kindness almost broke her resolve not to blurt all. "I'm doing well enough," she said, and immediately launched into an explanation of her reason for the visit. "I'm going away for a while, and I'd like to leave you in charge of my affairs," Melody explained. "I also wish that my plans remain between us." She gave him a pointed stare. He nodded. "That's good. It's good to take some time before committing oneself to something as serious as marriage." Guilt flooded Melody. What would he say if he knew her plans to go west to marry a complete stranger? Chapter 5. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Lance peered over his brother Emery's shoulder to look at a photograph of a pretty young lady smiling into the camera. There was no mistaking that whoever she was, she came from a well-off family, judging from her clothes and her upright stance. "She sure is," Lance said more for his brother's benefit than his own conviction. His eyes and heart had become closed off to pretty ladies, and the only women he was close to were his sisters. As far as he was concerned, women were not to be trusted, and he decided he was done with them for good. Lance waited for the pain to come, but it didn't. He had become accustomed to the ache in his chest that always came when he thought about Elizabeth. Now he looked back on that period with detached emotions. Without the pain of heartbreak, he saw that Elizabeth running off when she did had been a good thing. Had she waited until they'd had children, she would have broken more than Lance's heart. She would have hurt their children, and that would have destroyed him. At the time, he had been too devastated to see her leaving when she did as an advantage. He turned his attention back to the present. "So you'll send the ticket then?" he asked his dark-haired brother. "Oh, yes, there's no doubt in my mind," Emery said with feeling. "Now that you've had a good look at her face." "It's true what they say that a beautiful woman can be forgiven all other vices," he teased Emery and then grew solemn. He could jest about it now, but in the future he would steer clear of beautiful women such as Emery's mail-order bride. Fetching women were trouble. The attention they got from men spoilt them, and the risk of having your heart broken was great. Emery's laughter interrupted his musings. "It's very true, brother. Surely no one would be averse to waking up next to such a pretty face." He held out the picture. Lance stole another look and swallowed hard. He envied his brother his willingness to open his heart to love. Still, no one deserved it more than Emery. For years after the death of their parents, they had both cast aside their own ambitions to ensure that the ranch ran profitably to provide a living for them all. "What about you?" Emery asked. Their eyes locked. The question surprised him. Of all people, Emery understood how much Elizabeth had hurt him. His pride had healed, but his heart had closed to all risk of more pain. You can't deny yourself a wife and family because of what Elizabeth did, Emery said. How many years has it been, brother? 3. 3 years and 4 months, Lance corrected without thinking. His brother's eyes widened. You can't live like that. Says who? Lance retorted. Emery inhaled deeply. Listen to me, and I'll not repeat this again. Life is a gift, and you must begin to see it that way. It hurts me and our sisters seeing you like this. We all want you to be happy. Give love another chance. A lump formed in his throat, and he couldn't speak. It had been beautiful at the beginning. Elizabeth had been fun and beautiful, and she had brought laughter into his life. He'd also liked that she had been a lady from the East, and she had constantly teased all of them about their backward rural ways. She had taught his sisters the latest fashions in the East, and she had treated Emery like a younger brother. But Lance had also seen another side to her. A tendency to flirt with the ranch hands, or men visiting the ranch when she thought no one was in the vicinity. He had dismissed her behavior as a harmless way of entertaining herself. Besides, she had been a beautiful woman who enjoyed compliments from other people as well as her husband. He wasn't going to deny her that. How foolish and naive he had been. As time went by, a look of discontent had formed in her eyes, and she had become restless. He should not have been surprised when she ran off with the investor from the East, but it had shocked and destroyed him. Remembering all that anew, he shook his head. No, he was done with love. I'm off to town. I'll be back before dark, Emery said with a sigh, and with a wave exited the library where Lance worked on the ranch records. His gaze fell on the hundreds of books on the shelves which had not been opened since his mother's death. Unfortunately, none of them had inherited their ma's love for reading. Perhaps Emery's wife would turn out to be a reader and make use of the books. With Emery gone, he returned his attention to the column of figures before him. He worked steadily for the rest of the afternoon, stopping only when he realized that he was straining to see. He cursed under his breath and shot to his feet. He'd intended to take his customary last look around the ranch. Lance strode through the house to the kitchen, exited, and made for the stables. On seeing him, a ranch hand hurried to saddle his horse. Once his gelding was ready, he mounted and urged his horse into a canter. He heard the hooves of an approaching horse, and thinking it was Emery, brought his horse to a stop and waited. He sure was in a rush, Lance thought, dust blinding him to the horse and its rider. Boss! It was Gerald, one of the newer ranch hands. What is it? Lance asked. Gerald stopped his horse directly in front of Lance's horse, and, for what seemed like minutes, he seemed to struggle to say the right words. Speak up, man. It's Mr. Emery, sir, Gerald said. Something's bad has happened to him. Fear filled the pit of Lance's stomach. What do you mean? He's been hurt real bad. Come with me. Did you call for a doctor? Lance shouted, galloping after Gerald. Gerald did not reply, but when they reached the figure lying on his back by the side of the road, he understood why. He had a horrifying injury to his neck. With an animal cry, Lance jumped from his horse and ran to his brother's body, desperate for some sign of life. He touched his chest. Come on, Emery. Tears filled his eyes. No, it wasn't possible. He had been with Emery all his life. He couldn't die just like that. His eyes were rolled back, and his mouth was open. What would he tell his sisters? Already they had lost so much in a short 5 years. First, their ma had fallen sick and then died, and then their pa followed barely a year later. Them and now Emery. Knowing it was too late and his brother was gone, Lance shelved his grief for later. He stood up and faced the few men watching him. Who did this? They looked at each other, and then one spoke up. We don't know. We reckon it's the mountain gang. Word was that they passed this way. The mountain gang had been terrorizing stagecoaches and people for the last couple of months. Lance trained his eyes on the road and the plains beyond. He made up his mind. It didn't matter how many they were, he would avenge his brother's death. He turned to Gerald. Inform the sheriff. I'll be going ahead to see if I can catch up with them. But boss, Gerald started to say and then clamped his mouth shut. Lance gave him a curt nod, mounted his horse, and took off as though the devil himself was after him. Chapter 6. Every emotion had come over Melody as the days of travel merged into one. The train covered solitary plains, canyons, and valleys, but nothing could have prepared her for Cheyenne. Despite the carriage windows being shut, dust managed to seep into the interior of the train. She covered her nose and mouth with a handkerchief, her eyes staring unbelieving at the town. As the train whistled through the town, Melody fought the urge to burst into tears. She couldn't decide what was worse, remaining in Cincinnati at the risk of being murdered, or to relocate to what was clearly a God-forsaken land. Frame homes were arranged haphazardly on the plains surrounding the town, but the worst of it was the lack of trees. Everywhere she looked was brown and dusty. The train entered the depot, and with a blow of smoke, it came to a halt. Trembling from head to toe, Melody pulled her carpet bag from under her berth and prepared to disembark. It felt good to step on solid ground after days on the train. "Miss Melody Hanley," a voice called from her side. She turned and found herself staring into a pair of startling green eyes. She took in the rest of him and suppressed a shiver. He was tall, certainly over 6 feet, and his head was a mop of sandy blonde hair. "Yes," Melody said, her voice seemingly out of breath. He gripped her arm. "Come with me. We'll take your luggage first." One thing was for sure, he was not Emery Jenkins. Emery was gentle and sweet in his letters. It was not possible that her husband-to-be had turned into this rude, rough man who was now propelling her towards the luggage car. She pointed out her 3 trunks, and he shot her a look of disapproval before reaching for them. He seemed to command obedience, for soon he had an errand boy follow them with the trunks. "The wagon is waiting outside," he said, without looking at her, and stomped off. Melody was left staring open-mouthed at his retreating back. She had never met such a rude human being in her life. "Ma'am," the errand boy said to her, and, not wanting to make a scene, she followed the man out of the depot. A surge of indignation rose in her, but rather than confront him in front of the errand boy, she waited until her luggage was stashed at the back of the wagon. "Shall I help you up?" he finally offered. "No," Melody refused, and took great satisfaction at the confusion that came over his features. "I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me who you are and where Emery is," she said. He sighed deeply. "I had hoped this could wait until we got to the ranch. I don't want you to make a spectacle of yourself as women tend to do." Her jaw fell open. "How dare you?" He held up a hand to stop her tirade of words. "My name is Lance Jenkins. I'm Emery's older brother." Embarrassment flooded Melody. "Oh, dear Lord, I'm sorry. You should have said something instead of shepherding me out of the station like that." She giggled, but Lance did not join her. He looked at her with a curious detachment. She cleared her throat. "I assume that Emery sent you to collect me from the depot." He broke the stare and looked away. "Not quite. Emery's dead." A sudden coldness hit at Melody's core, and she went absolutely still. "What did you say?" He looked at her, and she saw it then, the shadow of grief in his eyes and the look of sheer exhaustion. "He's gone. Emery's gone. We buried him 2 weeks ago." "I'm sorry." "Why? What happened?" "He was killed by a gang of robbers when he was returning home from town." Melody's eyes took in her surroundings. Too many saloons to count, and roughly dressed characters leaning on walls or walking past, a place where death lurked at every corner. "Don't worry, you're safe enough," Lance said. "The robbers were all caught," he said, his voice cold. Her heartbeat thrashed in her ears. What would become of her? Winter is just around the corner. "You'll have to stay at the ranch until spring comes around," he said as he looked up at the gray skies. "We need to get going. I have a lot of work to do before dusk." Melody nodded. Their fingers brushed as he helped her onto the wagon, and she felt her heartbeat quicken in response. What was the matter with her? She scolded as she settled into the seat. She had just received the news that sweet, gentle Emery was gone, and all she could think about was how attractive his brother was. Shame flooded her. Lance sat beside her and took up the reins. Soon they were leaving the unsightly town down the lonely road. He did not make any effort at conversation, which was just as well. She thought of what Lance had said. He would be sending her back to Cincinnati when winter ended. A shudder ran through her. After all her planning, nothing would make her return home to Cincinnati. She had saved her life, by God's grace, and she was not going back. She would look for a job if she had to. She wrapped her hands around her chest, Tears gathered in her eyes at the realization that she was in a strange, rough world and she was dependent on the kindness of strangers to survive. She stole a glance at Lance's unmoving profile. He didn't seem to possess an ounce of kindness. How was it that he and Emery were brothers? She had the feeling that he had hated her on sight. It made no sense. Sensing that she was looking at him, he turned to her and his eyes narrowed as if he couldn't bear the sight of her. Dear Lord, what was she to do? She remembered Emery's letter explaining that he lived with his brother and sisters. Melody cheered somewhat. The sisters were probably nice people like Emery. Maybe her stay at the ranch would not be so bad. Exhausted by the bouncing brought on by the rough road, Melody was relieved when they got off the main road, and she spied a sprawling ranch house at the end of the drive. As they got closer, she took in details of the charming ranch house. It had a wide porch with easy chairs arranged along its length, and the walls painted a bright white. Lance brought the horses to a stop in front of the porch. He got down without a word and proceeded to remove her luggage. Unsure of what to do, she waited until he was finished. The front door burst open, and a young woman with blonde curly hair came out smiling. She wore riding pants and a loose flannel shirt. Melody swallowed hard. She had never seen a young woman dressed in a man's shirt and yet looking so pretty. "Miss Hanley, you're finally here," she said, her boots pounding as she walked down the porch steps. "Lance, shame on you. You didn't give Miss Hanley a hand off the wagon. Come on, my dear, I'll help you down." Melody took the proffered slim hand and she jumped down, landing on the ground with an unladylike force. "Welcome home," she said, taking Melody's hands into hers. "My name's Bessie. I'm Lance's and Emery's younger sister." Melody's eyes filled at the warm welcome. Chapter 7. The interior of the house took Melody's breath away. The front door led into a square hallway with an intricately curved staircase that led to the floors above. "Come through this way to the parlor," Bessie said, leading her by the hand to an entryway on the left. The parlor made her forget that she was in the West. Big, comfortable chairs were arranged around a table, and a fire in the hearth emitted warmth into the room. The walls were decorated with paintings, each piece carefully chosen to reflect different landscapes. "Please have a seat," Bessie invited. "Lance, will you be kind enough to take Miss Hanley's luggage to Mary's old room?" She addressed Lance, who had followed them into the room. He nodded curtly and then turned to Melody with a cold look that took her aback. "I hope you understand that this is a working ranch. Everyone is expected to pull their weight around here. Nothing is for free. We're busy moving the cattle from one pasture to another. I expect to see you there with everyone else." Melody gasped. Nobody had ever spoken to her in such a rude manner. What was he talking about? The closest she had ever come to a horse was when it pulled a carriage. "I've never ridden a horse." Lance stared at her, grim-faced. "Why doesn't that surprise me?" She wanted to lash out, but she had nothing to say in her defense. If Lance knew that her shortcomings did not stop with horse riding, she had never worked a day in her life. There had been servants to see to her every need. She had never cooked or cleaned or even made her own bed. That was one secret she would keep to herself. She could well imagine the scorn on Lance's face if he knew. No, he must never know what a privileged life she had led. "May I call you Melody?" Bessie said. "You'll be so lonely in the house. We all go out to the pastures to help when there's a lot of work, like now." "No, she won't, because she'll be doing the chores," Lance snapped and stalked out of the room. Her instinct was to flounce out of the room and return to the depot. She did not belong on a ranch. Their lives were foreign to her. She could feel tears of self-pity gather in her eyes. She did not blink, afraid that they would fall and prove to Lance that she was indeed a weakling. "Don't mind him," Bessie soothed. "He's not normally that grumpy, but Emery's death has really taken a toll on him. On all of us, actually," she added in a sad voice. "I'm so sorry," Melody said, guilt filling her. Since hearing the news of Emery's death, she had only thought of herself and how his death would affect her. She had not once thought of the loved ones he had left behind, people who knew and loved him all their lives. She had only met him through letters, and other than what he wrote, she had not known him. therefore she could not mourn. But Lance and his sisters had lost someone they loved, just as she had lost her parents. "I understand how it feels to lose a loved one," she said. "Yes, Emery told us about your parents. I'm sorry, too, for your loss," Bessie said. After a moment, she gave a mirthless chuckle. "Look at the pair of us. Come on, I'll show you to Mary's old room. It's next to mine, and the best of all, we have a washroom between our rooms." The reference to Mary's room sharply reminded Melody that she was a stranger here. Determination rose in her chest. She would do everything she could to earn her keep. Lance would have no reason to scold her ever again. She followed Bessie up the curved staircase, which reminded her so much of her own home. Could her parents see her from heaven? Her chest contracted, and a sharp pain went through her. How terrible it was when one became an orphan. One went from love and security to being at the mercy of strangers. It would have been far better for her had Emery been alive. He would have protected her from his older brother's meanness. Her arrival would have been celebrated, not dreaded. Mary's old room was big and airy, and the window looked out to the back of the house and the pastures. All over the hills, she made out herds of cows grazing, and while she looked out, a man on horseback rode out of the barns. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Lance. Her chest rose up and down, and she was afraid that Bessie would hear her breathing hard. "Do you think you'll be comfortable here?" Bessie asked. Melody dragged her eyes from the disappearing figure. "Oh, yes, it's very nice, thank you." Bessie kept her hand on the doorknob and beamed. "You're welcome. The washroom is next door. I'll get someone to fill up the bath, and afterwards you'll find some food on the range in the kitchen." "I don't know what to say," Melody said, overwhelmed at the other woman's thoughtfulness. "Don't say anything. Emery would want us to make sure you're comfortable and lacking for nothing. I'll be out in the garden if you won't feel too lonely alone in the house." "I'll be fine," Melody said, remembering living alone in her old home. When Bessie left, she returned to the window and gazed out, hoping to catch a glimpse of Lance. She didn't understand herself. Here was a man who had treated her deplorably, and yet something about him drew her in. What sort of a woman did that make her, to be attracted to such an unlikable fellow? Chapter 8. Lance gave up on trying to work. He dropped his ink pen and sat still, straining for Melody's movements in the kitchen. Bessie had gone off to town with her fiancé to run errands, and he and Melody were alone in the house. What was she doing? Telling himself that he wanted to check if she was all right, he stood up and headed to the kitchen. He stopped at the doorway and observed her as she wrestled with a potato and knife. By the time she was done peeling it, most of the flesh of the potato had been sacrificed. No matter what she said, Melody had never peeled a potato in her life. Her smooth, soft hands also told him that she had never worked a day in her life. Sympathy for her rose in his chest, and he squashed it down. As he had told her, theirs was a working ranch, and they could not afford to carry anybody on their backs. She looked up in surprise as he strode up to her and relieved her of the knife. Their fingers touched lightly, and heat spread through him. He cussed under his breath. What was the matter with him? She was a beautiful woman, and he was bound to react to her touch. It meant nothing. She meant nothing to him. "Let me show you how this is done," he said in a harsher tone than he'd intended. "Try not to get too much of the white flesh off the potato as you peel." She inhaled sharply, and when he looked up, their gazes met. Her eyes blazed with emotion. Taken aback, he said, "Are you all right?" "Of course I'm all right. You march in here and interrupt my work without asking. Why wouldn't I be all right?" She intoned cheerfully, so much so that it took him a good while to appreciate that it was sarcasm. Indignation filled him. "But you don't know how to peel potatoes. You needed someone to teach you, and as I'm the only one at home, I offered to do it. You ought to be thanking me, Melody." She scowled at him. He ignored it. "Do you need help with the stew?" he asked. He wasn't much of a cook, but he wasn't as terrible as Melody clearly was. Irritation spiked inside him. Bessie should not have left Melody alone on her first day to prepare a meal. "No, I'll be just fine, thank you." He stared at her and then shrugged. "All right, I'll get back to my work in the library." How did she intend to cook a stew if she couldn't even peel potatoes? He became suddenly curious about her. He needed no one to tell him that she had been born and raised with a silver spoon in her mouth. What had made her choose to become a mail-order bride? Emery had told them nothing about her family, except that she was from Cincinnati, a city girl, a girl who had never lived on a ranch, a girl unsuited to ranch life. What had Emery been thinking? Then he remembered the day his brother had received the photograph of Melody and how happy he had been. Sadness gripped Lance as he slipped back into the library and sat behind the big desk. He would give anything to get his brother back. They had worked well together, each of them knowing what they needed to do to keep the ranch going. Emery had enjoyed working with the calves and ensuring they ate well and would be ready for the market when they grew. Lance worked with the ranch hands out in the pastures, and in the afternoons he kept the records updated. A soft knock on the door brought him back to the present. "Come in," he barked, irritated at the interruption. "I'm sorry, but I need help," Melody said, her blue eyes wide. "What is it?" "It's the stew. The beef is boiling, but I don't know what to do with the potatoes." He should have been annoyed, but he wasn't. He nodded curtly and stood up to follow her into the kitchen. Minutes later, he was deep into an explanation of how to prepare stew. "The more vegetables you have, the thicker the stew will be," he said, echoing what he had heard his mother explain to his sisters all those years ago. He got carrots out the pantry, as well as all the vegetables he could find. They worked steadily, peeling and throwing the diced vegetables into the huge pot with the meat and water. Soon, a sweet aroma filled the kitchen as Lance added fresh garlic cloves. "Where did you learn how to cook?" Melody asked him. "By listening to my mother teaching my sisters. Mary hated to cook, so I'd sometimes help her when Ma wasn't home," he explained, memories from the past washing over him. Theirs had been a happy home, and he had loved growing up on a ranch. They had never lacked for anything, but in return, everyone was expected to pitch in. "Do you have brothers or sisters?" he asked her. She shook her head. "It was just my parents and me." Lance recalled that Emery had told him about her being an orphan. He shifted his weight uncomfortable at dredging up her memories. "I never minded, though," she said softly. "I never knew any other way." His heart constricted, and he felt an urge to protect her. He almost laughed out loud. Melody was his dead brother's fiancée. True, she stirred up feelings he hadn't felt since Elizabeth, feelings he'd buried a long time ago and which he had no intention of acting upon. "I'm sorry you have to stay here for the winter," he said. She shrugged. "I'm all right. There's nothing waiting for me at home. Besides, I like it here. It's peaceful." He narrowed his eyes as he looked at her. He hoped she wasn't getting too comfortable. There was no place for her at the ranch. She had to leave when winter was over. He decided to remind her. "Well, as soon as winter is over, you'll go back home. I'm sure you have friends who will be happy to see you again." She looked at him with sorrowful eyes, and his heart lurched. He pushed away the feelings of sympathy and curiosity that assailed him. Melody did not want to return home. It was on the tip of his tongue to ask her why when he realized what a mistake that would be. It was not his affair. The last thing he wanted was to get pulled into her personal business. Whatever it was, she would handle it herself. "Yes, of course," she finally said, and broke the stare. "Thank you for your help. I'll do the rest," she said, and looked at him with cold eyes. The message had been delivered. She was not welcome. The only reason she was still at the ranch was the season. Lance didn't care how angry or hurt she was, as long as she understood that come spring, she would be on her way home. Chapter 9. "I'm sorry I left you to cook our dinner yesterday," Bessie said to her the following day. "I felt bad after Lance told me what a difficult time you had cooking." She placed a cup of tea on a stool in front of Melody. "Thank you," Melody said, dropping her sewing on her lap to sip at her tea. "I managed eventually with Lance's help." "You really can't cook?" Bessie asked, and sat down with her tea. Melody searched her face. It held curiosity, not mockery. She beamed. "I really can't. I never once thought I'd be called upon to cook." "Really? How come? Where did you grow up?" "I grew up in Cincinnati in the East," Melody explained. "Life is different there, and I'm afraid I was terribly spoilt. We had servants in our home, and so did all our friends. Her face burnt hot. She suddenly felt embarrassed at explaining her privileged life. I can't imagine not having to work, Bessie said. What did you do all day? Bessie giggled. I read, I sewed, socialized. I really don't know, but days zipped by. They chatted easily like old friends. Emery told me in a letter that you are engaged? Melody asked Bessie. She smiled, and her face took on a dreamy expression. Oh yes, Albert and I are planning to get married in 2 months, just as soon as our home is finished. Is it here on the ranch? Bessie nodded. Yes, Pa left the ranch to all of us. I just want to have a family with Albert. Melody envied Bessie her simple and secure life. Her life seemed so messed up by comparison. Bessie smiled and looked at her shrewdly. I have the feeling that you and Lance like each other, she said. What? Melody gasped. No, not at all. Lance cannot bear to speak to me in a civilized manner. She shook her head. Why would Bessie think that? Lance hated her. The object of their discussion chose that moment to walk into the parlor. Melody's face grew hot. In his right hand, he carried a jackknife and a plank of wood. Lance, you've been in there a long time, Bessie said. Melody and I are having tea. Would you like some before we retire? He smiled at his sister, and the lines on his face disappeared. Yes, please, Bessie. Thank you. He transformed from handsome and grumpy to so handsome, Melody's legs went weak. It was a good thing that she was seated. She lifted her cup to her mouth to hide most of her face. When he turned to her, the smile was gone. It hurt that he hated her for no reason other than she had come to his home. He gave her a curt nod and arranged himself on an armchair next to the hearth. He folded his body to fit in the chair, and she had to drag her eyes away from his back. Melody returned to her sewing, but she could feel her heartbeat thrashing in her ears. Bessie returned with his tea. Making something for Matthew? Bessie asked him as she handed him his tea. Yes, his birthday's coming up, and I thought he might like a new toy, Lance said. Melody had met Mary's 3-year-old boy, a sweet child content with playing with his toys for hours at a time. Everyone seems to be busy. What are you sewing, Melody? She smiled at Bessie. A bed quilt, she said, and held up some of the squares for her to see. That's pretty, Bessie said, and she smiled, pleased at the compliment. I never was any good with ladylike pursuits, Bessie said, sitting back down with a yawn. No need to be, Lance said. You do more than your fair share of work around the ranch. Melody's chest tightened, knowing the barb was aimed at her. Tired of being picked on, she said, We can't all be the same, Lance. We all excel in different areas. She met his gaze and refused to look away. Never in all her life had she been in a position that required her to defend herself. Since she arrived in Cheyenne, all Lance had offered her was criticism. She was ready to fight back. I didn't grow up on a ranch like you all did, so your ways are new to me. It'll take time to learn, but I'm willing to give it my best. Silence descended on the room. What are we doing tomorrow? Bessie quickly asked. We'll continue moving the cattle from the southern pastures to the corrals, Lance said. Winter would soon be upon them, and Melody had worked out from listening to conversations that feeding the cattle was easier when they were corralled. She listened as Bessie and Lance made plans for the next few weeks. She did not understand most of what they said, but she figured in a few weeks she would be an old hand. Bessie had been right. The days were long in the house with everyone gone. Hours crawled by, and she looked at the clock every 5 minutes. The peace she had enjoyed back home had deserted her, and after her chores, she found herself listless and bored. She needed something to do, and she had an idea. Old Miller, as Bessie had introduced him, was an old ranch hand and part of the family. He milked the dairy cows every morning and brought pails of creamy milk to the house. She had decided to ask him to teach her how to ride a horse. It would give her great satisfaction to show Lance that she was not completely hopeless on a ranch. She got her chance when old Miller ambled to the back door as Melody was preparing breakfast. Lance and Bessie usually left for the pastures before dawn and returned for their breakfast at 8. Morning, miss, he said, offering her a toothless grin. It's getting cold, isn't it? Morning, Melody said, taking the pail of milk from him. Thank you for the milk. Do you want to come in? I just made a pot of tea. He rubbed his hands together and beamed. Can I sit by the stove? These old bones are no good in the cold weather. Of course you can, Melody said with a chuckle. In the kitchen, she placed a cup on the work table and proceeded to prepare tea and pancakes for the old man. He made appreciative noises as he ate. I want to ask for a favor, sir, Melody begun. Call me Old Miller. Everyone does, and I like it, he said. Melody smiled. All right, I will. I don't know how to ride a horse, she said, and paused to wait for the shocked reaction. None came. He merely continued chewing with his eyes on her. I was hoping that you could teach me how to horseback ride, she finished. He contemplated her for a while without speaking. Are you afraid of falling in the mud? Probably, but I can get used to it if I have to, Melody said, and he burst into laughter. You have spunk, and I like that. Tomorrow morning at 10 when I've finished my duties, he said. Meet me outside the barn. Melody could not stop the grin that split her face. Chapter 10. A slight drizzle fell on Lance and Bessie as they crossed the backyard and made for the ranch hand's main hall. Lance grabbed the doorknob, pulled the door open, and gestured for his sister to go in. Warmth immediately enveloped him as they stepped into the large open hall. The scent of coffee tantalized him, and he followed Bessie to the table and breakfast and coffee. He poured himself a cup of coffee and gratefully wrapped his hands around it for warmth. Lance, said a voice behind him. It was Joseph, his sister, Mary's husband. Lance beamed at him. It's a cold one, isn't it? Joseph sipped his coffee. It sure is. There's no doubt that winter is on us now. They chatted easily for the next couple of minutes. Lance was proud of the men his sisters had chosen. Joseph was hardworking, and he cared about the ranch as much as Lance himself did. He looked over at Bessie and Albert huddled together. His parents would be proud of them. He squirmed uncomfortably as he thought of his own life. It seemed so empty by comparison. His mind drifted to Melody, and he wondered what she was doing now. Probably waking up and getting tea going. Lance lit the stove in the kitchen every morning so that when she went to the kitchen, she would not feel too cold. He told himself it was what any decent person would do, but now in the warmth of the men's hall, he admitted that he was drawn to Melody. She was the prettiest woman he had ever laid eyes on. When she wasn't looking, he found himself staring at her, his thoughts wandering. Mary's looking forward to having you for Matthew's birthday dinner on Saturday, Joseph was saying. We're looking forward to coming, Lance said, thinking it would be good for Melody to take a break from cooking dinner. Matthew's growing so fast. Joseph beamed. He is, and he can't wait for what he believes is a brother. Mary's just about had enough of carrying that babe. They chuckled softly as they all contemplated the wonder of ladies bringing forth new lives. She said to remind you to come with that lady friend of yours, Melody. She can't wait to meet her. Lance frowned. She's not my lady friend. She was coming to marry Emery. Joseph shrugged, his mind clearly moving on to other matters. I want to send a group to scout the western pastures for any calves and their mothers that we might have missed. Lance nodded, having complete confidence in Joseph's abilities, being his head ranch hand. He and Emery had discussed it, and they planned to promote Albert to assistant ranch head. Like his father, they preferred to keep the ranch in family hands. And besides, most of the ranch heads were drifters and never stayed in one place for more than 2 years. He decided to join with the group of ranch hands working in the western pastures. Later in the morning, they were rewarded when they heard the distressed lowing coming from a dip in a hilly part of the pasture. It was a calf, only a few weeks old from what Lance could tell. He dismounted and hitched his horse to a tree. He approached the calf and saw that it was not harmed, just stuck in the fence and probably hungry. He told the rest of his team to keep scouring for more while he tended to it. He saw her as he rode towards the ranch house, the calf balanced on his lap. She was bent over, sweeping the backyard, her chestnut brown hair falling around her face. He inhaled sharply and braced himself. She straightened herself at that moment, and their gazes fused. Something akin to fire ran through him. How would he manage to keep his rapidly developing feelings for Melody under control? Her eyes moved to the calf across his legs, and she met him at the entrance to the barn. What happened? She asked, Her brow creased with concern. He's 7%. She got stuck in the fence, and I suppose his mother left her there, Lance explained. He looks cold, she said, and reached out to pat the calf. Lance wished she was patting him instead, and he immediately chastised himself for such a ridiculous thought. He guided his horse inside the barn and with Melody's help placed the calf on clean straw, prepared for such instances. "Where did you find her?" she asked. Lance beamed, unable to help himself. "It's a girl, then?" She looked up and gave him a smile that stopped his heart. Of course, only girls can look so sweet. He shook his head. Only Melody would think that the calf with its big head and large eyes was pretty. "We'll need to feed it milk since its mother has deserted it," Lance explained. "I can do that," Melody said quickly, "if you could show me how to." "That will be a lot of help, thank you," Lance said, pleased with her enthusiasm. Her nearness was interfering with his thinking. "I'll get the bottle and the milk." The cold air blowing against his face brought him back to his senses. He must not allow himself to fall in love with Melody. Once was enough. He knew that he could not again deal with the kind of pain he had felt after Elizabeth left him. He marched into the house and came out minutes later carrying a bottle of warmed milk. In the barn, Melody was squatting beside the black and white calf, softly stroking it and whispering to it. He knelt on the opposite end, and his nostrils were soon filled with the womanly scent of Melody. Her scent was becoming familiar and comforting to him. As if sensing that nourishment was within reach, the calf struggled to its feet. Lance placed the bottle at the calf's muzzle, and after a few seconds it opened its mouth and he tilted the bottle. "Oh, look at that. It knows exactly what to do," Melody exclaimed. "Do you want to feed it?" "Yes, please," she said and came around to his side. He showed her how to hold the bottle while trying to ignore her nearness. "How many times will I need to feed him?" she asked. "Thrice a day, same as us," Lance said as he sat back to watch Melody and the calf. He longed to reach out to smooth the wisps of hair playing on her forehead. His chest filled with longing, and he realized just how much he had missed female companionship. Had she fallen in love with his brother? "Do you miss Emery?" he asked before he could check himself. She looked surprised at the question, and she gave it some thought before answering. "I miss not having met him," she said, clearly choosing her words carefully. He liked that about her. She did not just blurt out whatever came to her mind. He sounded very sweet and kind in his letters. "He was," Lance said, his voice gruff. "He never had an evil bone in his body." Chapter 11. After a sumptuous dinner, their faces were all aglow when they gathered in the parlor to drink tea and give Matthew his birthday presents. The toy horse Lance had carved was an immediate hit. "Thank you, Uncle Lance," Matthew said, his head bowed low as he made the horse gallop across the rug. "You're welcome," Lance said and patted his nephew's head. "I wasn't very prepared," Melody told his sister, "but I just finished this quilt in time. It will keep Matthew warm in his bed." She handed his sister a package wrapped in brown paper. "Thank you," Mary said, unwrapping the paper. It was a familiar pattern of material, and Lance recognized it as the quilt that Melody worked on most evenings. Shame flooded him when he remembered how quickly he had dismissed her work. Joy spread across his sister's face. "I wish it was bigger. I would have kept it for myself," she said, draping the material over her legs. Matthew received gifts from his Aunt Bessie and his soon-to-be Uncle Albert. Lance's eyes shifted to Melody as if pulled by a force he could not resist. Her face was illuminated by the fire in the hearth, and she looked so happy and pretty. Just for a second, he wished she belonged to him, that after they left Mary and Joseph's home, they would be going home together as husband and wife. His heart stumbled in his chest at the thought. His sisters and Melody spoke about the impending birth, and the men's conversation moved to matters of the ranch. Lance listened with one ear, his attention on Melody. He liked that she and his sisters got along so well. Mary made to stand up to get something, and Melody quickly offered to do it for her. She had changed so much in the couple of weeks she had been with them, and yet she was the same Melody. The ranch no longer scared her as much, and she seemed to have found her place. It was a shame that she would be returning to her home. Not wanting to think of Melody's leaving, he turned his attention back to Joseph and Albert. At some point, she yawned, and he took that as a cue for them to leave. "Albert and I will stay a little longer," Bessie said. Lance looked at Albert, who nodded. "I'll make sure she gets home safe." He had no worries about leaving his sister in the care of her fiancé. Albert had proven himself over and over again. He would not compromise his sister's honor in any way. They said their goodnights and stepped out into a strong wind that could have lifted a man off his feet. Without giving any thought to his actions, Lance reached for Melody and wrapped his hands around her waist. As they made their way home, all he could think of was how small and soft she felt. It was torture to be so close to her and so attracted to her, and yet she would never be his. No matter how his feelings for her grew, he would not allow himself to love her. The sooner winter was over, the better it would be for both of them. She would go back to Ohio, to her comfortable city life, and he would continue with his own life. The thought did not hold much appeal, but he told himself it was for the best. They burst through the back door of the house and immediately made for the stove, where they held their hands out for warmth. "I don't know if dinner was worth the trouble of braving that cold," Lance said. She laughed, a delightful sound that reverberated through the kitchen. "I'd say it was. You have a wonderful family, and it was nice being with them." "I suppose it was," Lance grudgingly agreed. Comfortable silence fell between them before she spoke. "Why is it that you're not married yet?" Startled at the question, he did not immediately answer. When he did, it was in the cold voice he used when speaking of Elizabeth. "I'm surprised that no one has told you." "Present. Word gets around on a ranch," he said. "I was married for a short while to a woman named Elizabeth." "Oh, what happened?" she said. "Please don't tell me that she passed on." Her response broke the tension of the moment. He glanced at her with amusement. Ranches are considered pretty safe places to live. Her cheeks flushed, and he reached out and touched her right cheek. It was rosy and as soft as he had imagined. His eyes moved to her mouth, and for a second he could not breathe as he imagined how it would feel to kiss her. Shocked by his actions, he withdrew his hand as if a snake had struck him. He tried to continue speaking as though nothing had happened. "To answer your question, no, she did not pass on. It was worse. She ran off with a businessman from the East. In her letter, she said she could not abide by life on the ranch. It was hard and boring, and there was nothing to occupy her time." He felt bad for saying her desertion was worse than death, but that was how it had felt. "That's terrible," Melody said. "There are truly evil people in this world." He searched her face and saw the shock in her eyes. Why had he imagined that she and Elizabeth were similar? They were not alike in any way or form. True, they were both from the East, from fairly wealthy families, but that was just about where their similarities ended. Melody was gentle and interested in other people, unlike Elizabeth, who had been too selfish to pay attention to anyone else. Melody did not crave male attention as Elizabeth had. Apart from Old Miller, Lance had not seen Melody speak to any other ranch hand. She kept pretty much to herself, and he liked that about her. Still, he thought, she was a woman, and women were dangerous. They stole your heart and did with it as they pleased. "I understand what it feels like to be betrayed," Melody said in a soft voice, bringing him back to the present. "Why didn't you get married after that?" He shook his head. "I don't have time for such things now. Especially with Emery gone, my attention is on the ranch. As you may have noticed, we all depend on it, and its profitability is crucial for the Jenkins family survival." She nodded. "That makes sense, but surely it does not mean that you'll sacrifice your whole life for the ranch? Your siblings are living their lives, aren't they?" He had no answer for that. He couldn't very well tell her that he was afraid to be hurt again. Saying it out loud would make it seem so trivial, and yet he had never felt such awful pain in all his life. It hit him that he had said too much. He'd opened himself up too much to Melody. Regret came over him, but it was too late. The last thing he wanted was to give her any ideas. "Why don't you go on to bed and I'll stay a while and wait for Bessie," he said curtly. He saw the confusion in her pretty brown eyes and guilt flooded him. He looked away, unable to bear the hurt in her eyes. It was better this way, he told himself as she left without a word. Chapter 12. Melody's eyes took in the words on the page, but her brain refused to process their meaning. Finally, she let it rest on her lap and gave in to the thoughts that had plagued her all week. Lance. Since that night after dinner at his sister Mary's, he had gone out of his way to avoid her. Sometimes he did not come in for the noon meal, preferring instead to eat with the men in their hall. She did not understand him at all. What had she said or done to offend him? She shook her head. Mary had invited her to her home any time during the day, and seeing the afternoon stretched out before her, she decided she might take her up on her invitation. Melody sighed with satisfaction. It felt good to have all her chores completed early and to have free hours to herself. She would never have imagined that her life would come to this, but she liked it. She liked feeling useful and knowing that her work was contributing, albeit in a small way, to the smooth running of the ranch. "What are you doing?" a voice said. She jumped, startled. She had not heard Lance enter the library. "This is not Cincinnati where you have servants seeing to your every need," he said. "Everybody's out at work, and you're here in the library relaxing." Stung by the words and the unfairness of the accusation, tears filled her eyes. "I've finished all my chores," she retaliated, not caring whether she was overheard by anyone in the house. "I've been working all morning." She jumped to her feet and, without waiting for a response, ran out of the library. Taking 2 stairs at a time, she fled to her room and fetched a coat. She could not stand to be in the same house as Lance. The tears fell freely from her eyes as she walked the path that led to Mary's home. What had she done to make him hate her so? There was no doubt in her mind that Lance detested her. Yet, no matter how hard she searched, she couldn't find a reason for it. She got to Mary's house and knocked rapidly on the front door, her breath coming out hard and fast. The door flung open, and Mary stood grinning at her. "You don't know what a pleasure this is," she said. "I'm going out of my mind here. Matthew is down for his nap, and I'm just about fed up with carrying this babe," she said cheerfully. Melody chuckled and then wiped the wetness from her cheeks. She'd forgotten to clean herself up before knocking. Mary frowned. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" she asked, her skin going pale. "No, everything's fine," Melody said quickly. "Really, it's just me being silly." Mary touched her arm and gently shepherded her into the house. "I'll make us a nice cup of tea, and you can tell me how you think you're silly." Melody settled down on a chair in the small parlor and sighed with contentment. Something about Mary and her home made one instantly feel at home. She was the one who mostly resembled Lance, with similar sandy blonde hair and eyes so green they seemed to pierce one's soul. But that was where their resemblance to each other ended. Where Lance was cold and rude, his sister Mary was gentle and caring. She returned moments later carrying 2 cups of tea and handed Melody one. "So tell me what happened to upset you so," Mary said. "I hope it's not that brother of mine. He has a tendency to think only after speaking." Melody giggled at her description of Lance. "I feel silly even saying this, but I'm sure Lance hates me, and I can't figure out what I've done to deserve the way he treats me." "Why do you think he hates you?" Mary asked. "Take today, for instance. I'd finished all my chores and was reading a book in the library when he came in." Melody's voice caught as she narrated what had transpired between her and Lance. Mary was silent for a while. "I think you remind him of the feelings he had for Elizabeth. If you ask me, I think Lance has feelings for you." Melody wanted to laugh out loud. Instead, she said, "Really?" Mary chuckled. "Joseph was the same way with me. I worked in the pastures with him, just as Bessie does with Albert. I worked so hard I thought I'd collapse from exhaustion, but Joseph never saw it. He criticized me all the time. He told me later that he'd hated the fact that he was in love with the boss's daughter." Melody cocked her head to the side. Could that be it, that Lance was in love with her? Then she remembered the hatred that had blazed from his eyes when he lashed out at her. "No, that's not it." "Are you sure?" Mary asked. "I'm very sure. Do you want me to have a word with him?" Melody smiled through her sadness. "Thank you for offering, but no thank you. I'll just have to bear it until spring comes around and I can go back home." It was time to face her future. She could not stay at the ranch with Emery gone, and with Lance hating the very sight of her. A plan was slowly developing in her mind. She would write to her lawyer and have him transfer some funds to a bank at Cheyenne. Going back to Cincinnati was not an option, and besides, the West had grown on her. She could make her home here, but so far she had no idea what she could do. Perhaps open a store? That seemed so difficult. Well, if he gets worse, you come and tell me, and I'll box his ears until he comes back to his senses, Mary said with feeling. Thank you, Melody said, and decided to change the topic. When is the baby due? Do you know? Mary made an exaggerated sigh, and they both laughed. She wished she had a sister like her. Bessie was also kind and friendly, but she spent all her free time with Albert, which was perfectly understandable. Unlike Mary, she did not have the time to sit around chatting. Chapter 13. Lance paced the width of the library. Melody had been gone for 2 hours, and he could not bring himself to settle down to work. He knew what the trouble was. He was angry at himself. What had she done to deserve the harsh tone and words he had thrown at her? Just a few weeks earlier, he had been wishing for someone to make use of their father's extensive library. And then he had come upon Melody doing just that, and he had chastised her. He was like a man with no self-control. Where had she gone? He stomped out of the library and into the kitchen. Everything gleamed and sparkled, and a huge pot bubbled on the stove. She had even prepared their evening meal. On the large table where they ate their meals was a single rose in a vase. Her housekeeping skills had increased tenfold, he acknowledged to himself. He owed her an apology, Lance admitted to himself. If only she would come home. He felt like a caged animal peering out the window every few minutes. There were not many places for Melody to go, and he had an inkling that she was with Mary. He would fetch her, he decided. He hurried to Mary's house and bound up the porch. He pounded on the door with an urgency he could not explain. "Where's the fire?" Mary asked. He grinned foolishly. "No fire. I'm looking for Melody. Is she here?" She made as though to speak and then seemed to change her mind. "I'll get her." A few minutes later, Melody appeared, her eyes red-rimmed. She had been crying. She looked at him warily as though she expected another scolding. "I was rude to you earlier and it was underserved," he said. She inhaled deeply. "If that's an apology, you're doing a poor job of it." He beamed. "I'm sorry. Can I show you how apologetic I am by showing you something?" Melody narrowed her eyes. "What?" "You'll have to trust me. Get your coat." She nodded and entered the house, returning moments later wearing her coat. "It's a little far by foot," Lance said with a frown. "We can go on horseback," Melody said. "You have to know how to ride first, Melody, and it takes time, I'm afraid," he said, shooting her an amused glance. It was just like a city girl to assume that all one needed to do in order to ride a horse was to mount it. "I know that," she snapped, her voice laced with anger. "I didn't mean to offend you," Lance said. He seemed to be doing that a lot. To appease her, he followed her back to the barns. "Now what?" he said, standing with her beside the horse stalls. "Now you saddle the horses," she said. "I'll take Lady there. She's gentle and mild." His eyes widened, and he turned to her. "How do you know her name?" He had never seen her near the horses. She grinned, and his insides turned to jelly. "Old Miller has been teaching me how to ride a horse," she said proudly. Despite himself, Lance was impressed. "Really? When?" "When you all go off to the pastures. I figured I might as well learn how to ride, seeing that I live on a ranch." Not for long. He bit back the retort on the tip of his tongue. "Well, let's see how good a teacher he is," he said, and proceeded to saddle his gelding and then Lady. He held the reins for Melody and helped her up. She took the reins from him without displaying any signs of nervousness. Seeing that she was comfortable, he mounted his own horse. "Just to let you know, my pace is slow," she said when they left the barn. "Not to worry," he said. "We'll go at your pace." He watched her posture and her confidence and was impressed. Old Miller was more than a good teacher. Teaching a city girl how to ride a horse deserved a medal. He refused to acknowledge the voice at the back of his head, insisting that Melody could also be a fast learner. "Where are we going?" she said. "You're very patient, aren't you?" Despite the cold, Lance felt wonderful. riding through the pastures where everywhere the eye fell was their land. It wasn't just that. It felt good to be with Melody. Just for that moment, he would think of her as any other woman and just enjoy her company. "We're going to the creek. It runs along the border of our land," he explained. She fell silent. Emery had probably told her about it in his letters. They rode peacefully through the pastures, passing cows grazing in the winter pastures, before leaving all that behind. "You have a lot of land," Melody commented. Pride flushed through Lance. Pa worked hard buying whatever land adjacent to the ranch that came up for sale. Nothing gave him as much joy as to know that he descended from a man with enough foresight to ensure that his family would never once lack. "We're almost there," Lance said as the swishing sound of water danced around them. He brought his gelding to a stop and dismounted, and then helped Melody down, trying to ignore the flash of attraction that ripped through him. He hitched their horses to a tree and then gestured for Melody to follow him. A clump of trees gave way to a clearing, which in summer was carpeted with lush grass. Now it was covered in a light dressing of snow. "It's so beautiful," Melody said as she moved to the water's edge. "Oh, look, there's fish in there." "Yes, it's a good spot for fishing and picnicking in the summer," Lance said, and then chuckled. "That is if you're the first one to reach it." It was a favorite courting spot for everyone, including the ranch hands. Once a girl experienced the peace and the beauty of the sight, the rest was easy, or so everyone said. Lance glanced at Melody, and for a second he wished it was summer, and things between them were simple, that he had no baggage and he was a normal man courting a girl, preferably one who had been raised in the West. That was silly thinking, he chided himself. Melody was who she was because of her past. She would be a different person if she had grown up in the West. "Oh, there's the bench that Emery told me about," Melody exclaimed and hurried to a large oak tree that towered over all the others. "He did build it." She sat on it and patted the empty space beside her. "Come and sit with me. I have a feeling that Emery can see us from heaven." Her excitement and joy were infectious. He did her bidding, and when he sat, she took his hand and held it. Lance closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine, just for once, that Melody was his woman. Chapter 14. Melody hummed a tune as she scrubbed a particularly grimy iron pot. It was the one they used to make broth, and it had grime on the inside and the outside. She lifted it from the sink and onto the ground for better scrubbing. She would clean the floor afterwards, she told herself. Voices wafted in through the slightly open kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. She straightened as Lance's voice wafted in. She frowned. He sounded angry. Her insides froze. She had not seen him angry for over 2 weeks, not since he had apologized to her. In fact, she could not remember being as happy as she had been since before her parents passed. And it was all because she got along with Lance. He was polite to her, and he was careful to thank her for the work she did. "You know what this means," Lance said. "Lost revenue. It means someone was not doing their work. Now, Lance, you know that's not fair. The ranch is extensive, and if a few cows escape, it's just awful luck if coyotes kill them. We'll hunt them down and ensure we don't lose any more cattle. It's the best we can do under the circumstances." Melody recognized Joseph, Mary's husband and the head ranch hand. She felt sorry for him to be at the receiving end of Lance's bad temper. Despite bracing herself for his entry, she jumped when he pushed the door open with more force than necessary. The pot and all the grime poured over the floor, with most of the grime landing on her feet. She almost laughed until she saw Lance's countenance. A flash of fondness came over his eyes but was quickly replaced by cold anger. "What's the matter with you? Can't you do anything right?" he bellowed. Before she could react, he marched over to her and took the pot from her hands. Pure, raw need raced through her as their hands touched. Stunned, she looked up and met Lance's glance. She had no doubt that he had felt it too. His mouth tightened into a thin line. He wasn't going to back down, and this time neither was she. Melody had reached the end of her tether. She had done everything in her power to get Lance to like her. He treated her well until something happened, and then he took his anger out on her. She had had enough. She was not some poverty-stricken girl dependent on him for her survival. Her parents had left her well off and she could take care of herself. "That's it," she said. "I'm done." She wiped her hands on her apron and purposely walked out of the kitchen. "Where do you think you're going?" "Come and clean this mess," Lance shouted. She whirled around when she reached the doorway. "You clean it yourself. I've had enough of you and your rudeness. I'm not staying here anymore. I'm going to stay in a hotel in town until I decide what to do." To her surprise, Lance burst out laughing. When his mirth ebbed away, he placed his hands on his hips and contemplated her. "You think this is Cincinnati where you can find big hotels? Have you forgotten how Cheyenne looks?" His words knocked her confidence a little as the image of the small, terrible, and stinky town floated into her mind. "Anything is better than staying here with you," she spat, with false bravado. He shrugged. "All right, do as you please, just don't say you were not warned. The only hotel in town, if you can call it that, is no place for a single woman to stay." A tremor ran through her, but she was not going to back down now. She left the house through the back door and made for the barn. She found James, a friendly young ranch hand, and told him to run her into town with the wagon. Afterwards, she returned to the house and made for her chambers, where she quickly threw her clothes into her valise. When she was done, she dragged both valises down the stairs and encountered Lance at the bottom. By now, her anger had petered off, and she knew that what she planned was dangerous. Frightened at what lay ahead, she said a silent prayer for Lance to beg her to stay. He did not utter a word. "May I help?" he asked, and took the valises from her aching hands. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he said, and she nodded. Outside, the wagon waited as James climbed up the porch and took the valises from Lance's hands. He stowed them at the back as Melody and Lance stood awkwardly together. When James was done loading her luggage, she descended the porch steps without a word to Lance. She walked slowly, waiting, hoping for him to beseech her to stay. Her heart sank when she realized that he was just as proud as she was. "Very well," she told herself as the ranch hand helped her up onto the wagon. It was time anyway for her to make her own way. It had just come sooner than she had planned. James took up the reins, and the wagon lurched and moved forward. She glanced at Lance one more time. Her heart squeezed at the realization that it would probably be a very long time before she would see him again. Regret etched itself in her heart at the manner in which they had parted. She offered him a small smile and a wave. He did not respond. The wagon lurched forward, and they left the ranch and the safety it represented. "Are you leaving us, Miss Hanley?" the ranch hand asked. "Yes," Melody said, glad for the distraction of a conversation. "I'm going to stay in a hotel in town for a while." A cold fear settled in her core. Her pride would not allow her to turn back to the ranch. Oh, Lance, why did he annoy her so easily? She could not control her own temper and impulsive actions around him. He frowned. "I don't know, ma'am. The hotel is not safe for a lady such as yourself." Fear coursed through her. "I won't feel good leaving you there. And there's old Miller to contend with when I come back," James said. "He'll tan my hide for leaving you there." "I'm not your responsibility, James, and don't worry, I'll be just fine," Melody said. They rode on for a while before James spoke up again. "I have a better idea. Ethel Anderson, the lady who owns the general store, sometimes rents out room in her house. Do you mind if we ask her? That'll be a much safer place for you to stay. Everyone looks out for Mrs. Anderson and her kids since her old man died. Both of us will be safe if you stay there," he added with a chuckle. Touched by his consideration, Melody touched his arm lightly. "Thank you so much. I appreciate your help." Chapter 15. Cheyenne was every bit as Melody remembered, and worse. Eyes sought her out and stared as she waited in the wagon for James to have a word with Mrs. Anderson. She kept her eyes on the door of the general store, willing James to return. She felt exposed out in the street with so many idle eyes staring at her. She almost wept with relief when James emerged from the store, a grin on his face. "She has room and will be happy to rent it to you, Miss Hanley," James said to her. "It also happens that she's looking for a sales clerk to help in the store, and I said I'd ask you." Melody's smile wavered. "I've never worked in a store. Won't I make a mess of things? I don't want to be a burden." The memories of the mistakes she had made when she first arrived on the ranch were still with her. She remembered Lance's angry reaction every time she made a mistake. She did not want the same to happen with her new landlord, though the temptation to say yes was so great. She was now used to feeling useful, and nothing would please her more than working to occupy her time. Wait until you meet Mrs. Anderson. You'll see that your worries were baseless. She's wonderful. Everyone in Cheyenne loves her. She'll be patient and teach you everything you need to learn. He sounded so sure. She decided to trust. All right. And thank you, James. I truly appreciate all your help. Don't mention it, Miss Hanley. James helped her down and went to the back of the wagon for her luggage. Come, she's waiting. She followed him into the store, her eyes blinking rapidly as she got used to the dimness of the store. The first thing she noticed was how well stocked the store was. Things were crammed into shelves and every available space, even on the ground. It's a right mess, isn't it? A voice said. Welcome to my store. I'm Ethel Anderson. Melody stepped forward and took the offered hand. Thank you. I'm Melody Hanley. What a pretty name you have. Her bright eyes twinkled as she spoke. A door behind her in the counter slid open, and a boy with red hair that resembled his mother's stepped into the store. This is Nathan. Say hello to Miss Hanley and show her up to her room. Nathan took her valises from James and gestured for her to follow him. Melody said goodbye to James and followed Nathan through the door behind the counter. She hadn't said more than a few words to Mrs. Anderson, as everything had happened so fast. They went up a dark stairway and emerged on a long landing. Through here is the parlor, and beyond it, the kitchen, Nathan said to her. He lowered her luggage to the floor. Might as well show you. She wanted to tell him not to bother, but he had already gone through the door. Her past experience had taught her it was best to be as little trouble to other people as possible. The parlor was small but cozy, and in the kitchen they found a girl, a copy of her mother, who was about 14 years old. Sarah, meet Miss Hanley, Nathan said. She's our new boarder. Sarah turned to her and smiled broadly. Welcome, I'm just getting dinner ready. Do you want some help? Melody asked. Oh no, Sarah cried. Our boarders are not required to do any work around the house. Besides, I enjoy cooking. They exchanged a few pleasantries before Nathan took her to her chambers located at the very start of another hallway. Sarah has the room next to yours, and Benjamin and I share the last one opposite Ma's. Benjamin? Melody asked. He's the youngest. You'll see him in the store. He likes playing between the aisles. Nathan deposited her valises in her simple but clean room with a window overlooking the street and excused himself. As soon as he left, her mind went to Lance and she wondered who would cook his dinner. She caught herself just as her worry was increasing. What was the matter with her? The man had more or less chased her from the ranch, and here she was worrying about his dinner. She shook her head. It was best to keep herself busy. Spying a small wardrobe, she proceeded to unpack her clothes and arrange them neatly in the wardrobe. When she was done, Melody went downstairs to get acquainted with the store and Mrs. Anderson. Is the room comfortable? She asked as soon as Melody emerged from the door behind the counter. I'm afraid it's a little small. No, Melody protested. It's perfect, just right for my needs. Besides, I'm just glad to have somewhere safe and warm to sleep. Mrs. Anderson smiled at her. You're a lovely girl, and so pretty. I wonder how Lance managed to let you leave the ranch, she said with a wink. At the mention of Lance's name, Melody looked away and feigned interest in the goods displayed on the counter. James told me you're looking for someone to help in the store? Yes, when he told me about you, I knew our good Lord had answered my prayers. The children are not much help as they attend the school just down the road, so I'm mostly alone during the day. I have to tell you that I've never worked in a store, Melody said, and added under her breath, or anywhere for that matter. Mrs. Anderson waved a dismissive hand. There's not much to it. We'll start by just keeping the store clean and a few simple transactions. You'll soon see how easy it is. Why, the night before I opened the store, I never slept a wink from worry. If it weren't for... She stopped mid-sentence, and when Melody looked at her to continue, she changed the topic. Why don't you take a rest? I surely don't expect you to start work right away. I'd rather work, Melody said. "I like to keep busy." The realization hit her that what she said was true. She had transformed from the lady of leisure she had been back in Cincinnati to someone who enjoyed working. How had she spent days on end doing nothing in particular? Her previous life seemed so foreign now. There was another reason, though, for her wanting to keep busy. It would keep her mind off of Lance. She wasn't a fool, and she knew that she was in love with him. She had worked it out over the last couple of weeks. It hadn't taken a lot to figure it out, but accepting it was another matter altogether. She had lay awake at night asking herself how she could love such a callous man. Her love for him was a secret that would remain with her. He would probably laugh until he cried if he knew. He would think she was insane. Chapter 16. After packing the customer's shopping, Melody worked out the total and accepted the payment from the lady. When the bell chimed, signifying that the customer had left the store, she turned to Mrs. Anderson and beamed. "I did it. That was my first sale with no help from you. Thank you for teaching me everything, Mrs. Anderson." There was something so satisfying about working, and now she understood how Bessie woke up before dawn and went to work with the rest of the men. Not that there was anything wrong with working in the home, but actually earning an income felt good. Melody had accomplished so much in a little time. She had opened an account in the bank on Main Street and had written to the family lawyer with instructions to deposit her income from her trust fund in the account. She didn't have to work, but she couldn't imagine spending her days doing nothing. Mrs. Anderson touched her arm. "It's me who should be thanking you. I can't tell you what a blessing you've been to me. Why, look at the store. One can actually see between the aisles." "I like working here for you," Melody said and smiled with satisfaction. It was true that after 2 weeks of being in the store, there was now a semblance of order. She spent each morning arranging goods on the shelves according to purpose. It pleased her that Mrs. Anderson appreciated her efforts. They chatted easily until the conversation turned to her. It was bound to happen, and she had been expecting it. After all, Mrs. Anderson had told her so much about herself. "How is it that you came to be in Cheyenne?" she said. "Where do I begin?" Melody said, and then started at the beginning, from her parents dying to finding out Brady's plans. It all seemed so removed from her life in Cheyenne that it felt as if she was talking about someone else. "You poor thing," Mrs. Anderson said. "You went through so much, and then you found poor Emery had passed on." "Yes, it was sad. He sounded like such a sweet man in his letters." "He was all right, but I personally think Lance Jenkins is the best. Not that I'm comparing a dead man and a live one," she added quickly. "Really? Are we talking about the same person? Lance has been horrible to me right from the beginning," Melody said. Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened, and then, to Melody's utter shock, she chuckled. "You got under his skin, that's what," she said, shaking her head. "I'd have given anything to see that. I thought he'd never recover after what that horrible wife of his did to him." "Yes, he told me that his wife ran off with another man," Melody said. "But surely that doesn't give him the right to be rude to everyone." Mrs. Anderson looked at her pointedly. "He's not rude to anyone, just you, Melody." "What do you think that means?" Melody shrugged. "That he hated her?" "Put yourself in his shoes, Melody," Mrs. Anderson said gently. "Imagine being left by your wife for another man. Wouldn't that make you a bitter person?" Melody grudgingly nodded. "It would," Mrs. Anderson insisted. "Now tell me this. What would happen when years later you develop strong feelings for another woman? Would you easily give in to them and risk getting hurt again?" Melody had no reply. It was food for thought. "I know the Jenkins family quite well, as my husband used to work for them and we lived on the ranch. My husband died in a barn on the ranch, and you know what Lance did? He bought this plot of land for me and built the shop and our quarters. He said that Mr. Anderson had worked for them all his life, and in turn, they would make sure his family never lacked. That's the kind of man your Lance Jenkins is." Melody opened her mouth to protest, but thought otherwise. Lance was not hers and would never be. In the days that followed, she thought about what Mrs. Anderson had said. Slowly, she started to believe that Lance could possibly have feelings for her. A man in his position would resist any feelings for someone after being so hurt by his wife. Her love for him grew the more she came to understand his actions. From what Miss Anderson had told her, Lance was a good and kind-hearted person. It was not just Mrs. Anderson who had kind words about Lance. Old Miller had commented that they all knew Lance's bark was worse than his bite. Surely all those people could not be wrong. A week after discussing Lance, he walked into the store, and for a second Melody thought she was seeing an apparition. He stood in the doorway and looked at her as if he could not get enough. She smiled at him as joy spread to every part of her being. She had missed him. "How are you, Melody?" he asked and crossed the distance between them. "I'm all right, thank you," she said. "Everyone's asking after you. I thought I'd come and check how you're keeping. What about you?" "I like it here. Mrs. Anderson is very kind." The door behind the counter opened, and Mrs. Anderson walked in. "Is that you, Lance?" she exclaimed before going around the counter to embrace him. "You don't come often enough." "I know, and I should," Lance said, his voice soft. "How are the children?" He looked at Melody while he addressed Mrs. Anderson, and Melody thought her heart would pump right out of her chest. He stayed a little longer, chatting with them, and when he left, Melody felt as if he had taken a piece of her with him. "That is a man in love," Mrs. Anderson declared. Melody shook her head. It was true that he did look at her a great deal, but maybe that was just his caring nature. What would stop him from courting her if he had feelings for her? She hated to raise her hopes and then get disappointed. "I don't know, Mrs. Anderson," she sighed. "He just needs time, or the right atmosphere. You're going to the dance on Saturday, aren't you?" Melody had heard about the church dance that was to be held the coming weekend, but she had not intended on attending. "I wasn't planning on going." "Oh, Melody, you have to go. How I wish I was young again. There is so much for you young people these days. I would bet my last cent that Lance will be there, and the only reason he'll go is so that he can see you." It was difficult not to catch Mrs. Anderson's enthusiasm and believe that Lance shared her feelings. She had to find out, Melody said to herself. If she didn't, she would live the rest of her life with regret and wonder what might have happened. Perhaps, as Mrs. Anderson had said, what Lance needed was a little encouragement. Chapter 17. There was an air of excitement as they boarded the buggies. Lance jumped into the driver's seat, and Bessie and Albert slipped inside. "Mary is upset that she can't go to the dance," Bessie said with a chuckle. "She used to love dancing," Lance said, but his mind was on Melody. He hoped that she would be at the dance, as that was the only reason for him going. He wasn't much good at dancing. His sisters teased him that he had 2 left feet when it came to dancing. When they were settled, he pulled the reins and they were on their way. His muscles were taut with anticipation and nervousness. The cause was Melody. He had thought of her every day and every night. With each day that passed when he didn't see her, his mood worsened. He knew he had been terrible company, especially for Bessie, and he vowed to do better. He just needed to see Melody once more, to soak in her presence, maybe dance with her, and then he would get over her. In the weeks she had stayed at the ranch, she had grown on him, and it would take time to get used to not seeing her. That was all it was. "Will you tell her, Lance?" Bessie asked from her seat in the back. Lance frowned. "Tell who and what?" "Melody, of course," she said. "We all know you have feelings for her. You're the only one who can't see it." He swallowed his annoyance, remembering his vow to be pleasant. "I don't know what you're talking about, Bessie." Bessie sighed loudly. "I feel sorry for you, gentlemen. You really make your own lives very difficult when you fall in love." "Love?" Lance said and almost dropped the reins. "I'm not in love with Melody, goodness. I hardly know her." "Of course you know her," Bessie retorted. "You lived under the same roof." "I'm not in love with her, and let's talk about something else," he said, unable to keep the note of resentment from his voice. He had been in love once with Elizabeth, and it had felt different to what he felt for Melody. With Elizabeth, there had been a sense of excitement and danger when he was with her. Melody, on the other hand, was restful. He never felt as though he had to impress her. That wasn't love, was it? "I told you," Albert quipped. "Until a man is ready to accept the inevitable, No one can make him see it, not even a beloved sister. They chuckled, and Lance tried to ignore them. Butterflies fluttered in his stomach as they neared town. What if she wasn't there? He should have just invited her to the dance, as normal men did. Then he remembered his reason for not doing so. He did not want to offer her hope when there was none. His love had gone with Elizabeth. He had nothing to offer a sweet, decent girl like Melody. She deserved better. A man who would love her without reservations. He saw her as soon as he entered the hall. His heart stopped as he took in her glowing appearance. She wore a pink dress that made her cheeks seem even pinker. She was laughing at something her partner had said, and his heart twisted with jealousy. She caught his eye, and the world went still. A ghost of a smile formed on her mouth before she gave into it and beamed. A happy laugh wanted to escape, but nothing could get past the lump in his throat. He'd had a hole in his heart over the last few weeks, but now it felt filled, complete. He found a corner from which he could observe Melody uninterrupted. She was so beautiful and decent and good. She was like a feast to a man who had been starving for days, and he greedily feasted in her presence. It gave him little satisfaction that she did not pay the men she danced with much attention, though she spoke to a few. Melody was a popular partner. She danced with almost every man in the room, and it took every ounce of his willpower not to pull her to him. Melody kept her eyes on the entrance of the hallway, but there was no sign of Lance. She fidgeted as man after man signed her dance card. By the time the fiddler got on the makeshift stage, her dance card was full. The first man came to claim his dance, and it continued in that vein for the first hour. Her spirits fell every time the door opened, and it wasn't Lance. She had been lying to herself, and Mrs. Anderson was wrong. Lance had no interest in her as a woman. Just when she had almost given up hope, he walked into the hall. She swallowed 1,000 pinpricks of excitement. She smiled broadly as she danced with another man, her eyes wholly on Lance as he made his way across the room. She knew he was looking for her by the way his eyes bounced around the room. When he spotted her, his features softened, and at that moment, she knew that he too had strong feelings for her. The rest of the world faded, and it was just her and Lance. He leaned against the wall and did not move his eyes off her. Her body sensed the importance of the moment, and she danced as though she was dancing for Lance alone. Man after man claimed his dance, and Lance maintained his position. At some point, Melody bumped into Bessie and Joseph. "Everyone misses you, especially Lance," Bessie said into her ear. "He's a real pain to live with these days. Come back home, Melody. My brother is miserable without you, even if he won't admit it." That piece of information pleased Melody. She sneaked a look at Lance and was pleased to find that he was still there. He was chatting with another man, but his eyes searched for her every so often as though he couldn't bear to let her out of his sight. All evening, Lance did not dance with anyone. Finally, the fiddler announced the last dance of the evening. As the song began, Melody found herself being turned into a man's arms, and as they slipped around her waist, she knew it was Lance. She felt as though she had reached home as they danced to the slow number. Warmth filled her. She felt so happy that she wanted to cry. Her heart belonged to Lance. There was no running away from it. Lance pulled her back a little, and she tilted her head to look into his eyes. She almost gasped at the raw emotion she found there. His eyes raked her face and settled on her mouth. She trembled as she felt exposed to his eyes. He opened his mouth as though to say something, and then promptly shut it. Chapter 18. Lance was quiet on the trip back home. He listened to Bessie and Albert's chatter as they discussed friends they had seen. Melody's beautiful, laughing face kept floating into his mind. They had left the dance half an hour ago, and he already felt lonely. He missed her. After bidding Bessie and Albert good night, Lance retired to his room and prepared for bed. When he slipped into the cool bed sheets, his brain refused to shut down. All he could think about was Melody. What seemed like hours later, he got up and went to look out the window. The stars lit the sky and shadows danced on the ground below. In his mind's eye, he saw Melody dancing, her hands wrapped around another man. The same feelings of jealousy he had experienced then returned. He wanted more, Lance acknowledged to himself. He had been wrong to think that if he spent time with her, his feelings would abate. Instead, it had intensified his feelings. He stared brutally out of the window, not taking in anything. He ached for Melody. In her company, he had felt complete, as if she was a necessary part of him. In the weeks they had lived together, he had started to picture Melody as a permanent part of his life. And he had fought it. Now, shame filled him as he remembered how rude he had been to her. He had never treated anyone as he had treated Melody, with so much resentment. In the dark and quiet of the night, Lance was finally honest with himself. He loved her. That was the only reason. He had fought his love for her, but no matter how hard he tried, it did not go away. Oh Lord, he had treated the woman he loved so abominably. He would make it up to her every day of their lives if she let him. His sister had recognized his feelings for Melody. He grinned now as he remembered how vehemently he had denied it. Now he let himself soak in the knowledge. Needing the hours to go by faster, Lance left his room. Passing Emery's chambers, he stopped. Was it wrong for a man to fall in love with his brother's fiancée? He pushed open the door and entered, holding up a lantern. He sat on the bed. What would his brother say if he could speak? The answer came to Lance as if Emery was by his side. He would tell Lance to take care of Melody, to treat her like the special lady she was, and to love her as Emery himself would have loved her. Peace descended on Lance, and he knew just what he would do the following day. It was time to stop living a lie, denying what was right in front of his eyes. He had wasted so much time fighting it. The minutes ticked by slowly. Morning seemed like 1,000 hours away. A pile of letters on the nightstand caught his eye. He scooted across the bed and grabbed them up, feeling terrible and yet unable to stop himself. The letters bore a female handwriting, and he suspected they were from Melody. He pulled out the bulky one, and his hands trembled as he read the contents with mounting shock and then sorrow. He had failed Melody in even more ways. It had been a busy morning for Melody, as Mrs. Anderson had left town to visit her ill sister. She had helped Benjamin, Mrs. Anderson's youngest, get ready for school and then clean the house before opening the shop. Mrs. Anderson would be pleased with the day's earnings, Melody thought. It was barely 9 in the morning, and the register was halfway full. It had been a busy 2 hours, and she was glad for the lull to allow her to catch her breath. As if on cue, the doorbell chimed as the door flew open. Lance entered the store, waving an envelope in his right hand. Her heart leapt at the sight of him, but soon her excitement gave way to worry. His face was set as if in stone, apart from a vein on his forehead, which bulged and twitched. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said, shoving the envelope at her. Prosody, Melody swallowed as she recognized her own handwriting on the envelope. "Tell you what? The truth of why you can't go back home. You should have told me the truth, Melody." She shrugged. "I don't want your sympathy. I'm not your responsibility, Lance." He closed his eyes and seemed to be trying to get himself under control. "Do you know how reading this made me feel? I didn't rest as I imagined that vile man plotting and planning to harm you." Her heart skipped as his voice broke. Hope swelled in her chest. He cared about her. "Come back home, Melody," he said. Her shoulders hunched as her heart shrunk. "I don't belong there, Lance, as you rightly pointed out." He turned away. Pain spread across her chest as if someone had plunged a sword in her and then twisted it for added measure. She had lost Lance. She thought he was leaving. Instead, he paced up and down in front of the counter. "I was a fool, Melody. I'm still a fool," he said, his voice ravaged. She knew it then without a shadow of a doubt. Lance loved her. He just had to figure it out for himself. "What I'm trying to say, Melody." She stifled a smile and fought the urge to run to him and fling herself against him. She needed to hear him say it. "Yes, Lance." "Is that I'm sorry," he said. "I treated you poorly and you did not deserve it. You're the sweetest person I know and I don't deserve you." She waited for him to go on, refusing to lose hope. She reminded herself of the pain he had experienced in the past after he had placed his heart in the care of a careless woman. It would take a step of faith on his part to believe that not all women were like his former wife. He had to learn to trust again. It was not easy. "But I can't live without you," he said. Her heart rate sped up. Every nerve in her body rose to her skin. "I love you, Melody, with all my heart and soul." Her heart stopped and her mouth fell open. He had done it. Tears filled her eyes. "Oh, Lance, I thought you'd never say it." A groan escaped his mouth as he made for her. He opened his arms and she stepped into them. Giddy joy flooded her. Relief felt like a warm blanket. "I love you, Lance," she said over and over again. Epilogue. "If you don't mind, Mr. Jenkins, I'd like to examine your wife privately," the doctor said, and Melody stifled a smile. "Melody?" Lance asked. "It's all right," Melody said, secretly pleased at the love that her husband displayed. "I'll be waiting outside," he said, and left the doctor's office. The doctor's stern look dissolved into a smile. "I wish all married couples loved each other as you two obviously do." Melody's face went hot. She and Lance had never been able to be discreet about their feelings for each other. "Please come to the examination table. I'd like to have a look at you, though I have an inkling as to what could be the matter." Having two sisters-in-law who were already married and with children, Melody too had an inkling of what might be ailing her. She had neglected to share with Lance, afraid of raising his hopes and having them dashed. She stood up and went behind the curtain that separated the examination bed and office. As she lay on the bed waiting, she mused over all that had happened in the last year. She had gotten married to Lance, and together they had returned to Cincinnati to wind up her affairs. They had sold the house, even though Lance had insisted she ought to keep it. But after a lot of thought, Melody knew she was finished with Cincinnati. Her future was in Cheyenne. She had hoped not to see Brady, but had bumped into him on the last day of their stay. He had accused her of bringing misfortune to his life. Ann Kensington had left him for a wealthier man, and he had lost his position at the bank. He had seemed to lose his mind as he ranted, and then he grabbed her arm in a most painful manner. And then Lance, who had remained to have a word with the lawyer, had appeared and twisted Brady's hand. "You just need to give me the word, Melody, and I'll break his hand," Lance had said. Brady had tried to fight back, but he was no match for a man who spent his life outdoors working on a ranch. "Let him go. Our Lord will judge him," Melody had said, and then addressed Brady. "I feel sorry for you." "Don't," Brady spat, moving away. "I'll do just fine." "But thank you anyway," Melody said, unable to resist. "Your actions led me to the love of my life. God works in mysterious ways," she had added, shifting her glance to Lance. The doctor cleared his throat, bringing her attention back to the present. "It is as I suspected, Mrs. Jenkins. You're expecting a child, and you're about 2 months along." Moments later, Melody burst out of the doctor's office, startling Lance and the receptionist. "It's a baby, Lance. We're expecting a baby." The smile on his face let her know exactly how he felt. He stood up and engulfed her in his arms, holding her ever so gently, as though she could break if mishandled.